And President Trump also signed executive orders rolling back protections for transgender people. While civil rights groups are vowing to take action if needed, there is concern the president's efforts have already caused damage.
With the stroke of my pen on day one, we're going to stop the transgender lunacy.
Amid all the uncertainty, some parts of this executive order are already being implemented, like passport and travel restrictions and shelter access.
Today, I saw it on my new passport mail.
Why is it that these crazy people, the insanity, the radical left, are willing to women over a man's right to be in a women's restroom?
What they're doing, these executive orders, they are going to kill children.
Imagine for a moment you're in an airport. You're exhausted. You've been traveling for hours. And you're craving your bed like someone who hasn't slept for 1,000 years. You approach the border every airport with international arrivals has in place. An impossibly long line with horrific blue carpet, littered here and there with long abandoned splodges of chewing gum, turned black with the dirt from hundreds of shoes. You get in line. You go for the E-gate. It'll be easier if you don't have to talk to someone. But you know you're almost guaranteed to be pulled away. You remember the flight in, how you were instantly flagged as suspicious by the scanner, which detects anything with a bigger bulge than a Barbie doll on a woman as a potential weapon of mass destruction. You remember the pat-down, how airport security insisted a man do it, how he insisted you take your top off, that you prove that those are breasts attached to your body, and not incendiary devices. The humiliation is, after having your body inspected front to back like it's a crime scene, you're forced to run, in danger of missing your flight. Luckily, the border doesn't have the scanner for arrivals. You place your passport in the scanner. The camera looks over you and, with a sinking feeling, you accept that this time won't be different. You're sent to the border guards to explain to them why your passport looks like that. Why the letter designating your sex doesn't match the picture. Why the picture doesn't match you. Any of the discrepancies this cursed document brings with it. What is guaranteed, however, is that you look suspicious. Something doesn't add up. The details on your passport are not consistent. And that, of course, leads the border guard to wonder, what are you hiding? You are at the mercy of who you will be faced with this time. What will be the temperament of the man who will decide if you get to go home or you get pulled aside? And all for a single letter on a piece of paper. One that was only added in the 1970s, something completely unnecessary, and one that has now been weaponized for this exact purpose. So that your every interaction with the state or any organization that requires ID, carries with it the threat of violence. The president, in all his wisdom, has decided how to deal with people like you. Live a life constantly on edge. One identity check with the wrong person, away from something unspeakable, or a return to the closet. A fate that even United States law would classify as cruel and unusual punishment. For now, it only comes back to you at these roadblocks, where the mechanisms of state demand you identify yourself in line with their new guidelines. But you've seen how they've expanded the bans on protests, how student activists, agitators, even just people in the wrong place at the wrong time, are increasingly at risk of arrest or even deportation for stepping out of line. And deportation almost certainly means being sent to Guantanamo Bay. And with the changes to the way the government sees you and people like you, a trip to a jail cell, even a normal one, feels like a death sentence. Not for the first time, you consider leaving the country. But where could you go when your ID marks you like this? It's clear the administration has already made the decision for you. You can't leave. Your fate is left in the hands of the very people declaring your existence an affront to biology, an affront to God. They want you to believe there are only two choices facing you. Every time you interact with a border guard, a police officer, a judge, a prison guard, only two possible choices. The closet or the casket. But there is another option.
There is no escape.
Oh, hi there. I'm Bridget Empire, someone who may or may not have endured similar scenarios to the ones outlined in that hypothetical little thought experiment. Yes, my passport picture may look like that of a man, while my real-life face is snatched and ready for the runway.
But you know I didn't die, okay? I had crystallized.
Oh.
And now I'm a glamazon bitch ready for the runway.
And my gender marker says F, until Wes Streeting and Keir Starmer decide that it doesn't anymore.
Fuck off.
But I will remain, whether out in the street or forced into hiding, the science and culture correspondent for esteemed resistance newspaper, The Daily Telegraph. The only newspaper in Britain that has been banned by almost every state on Earth. Not because we're pro-trans, but because they simply fear our power. And because Dan hasn't paid his taxes since 1066. Don't think too harshly of him though, dear viewers. He's still getting over the end of the House of Godwinson. He'll have steeled himself to accept Norman rule by about let's say 2077. Basically just in time for the climate apocalypse. I'm here today to talk about state-sponsored transphobia. Specifically about how that's done using gender markers. The way the state uses documentation to control its populace, especially of minority groups they don't like, and about Hunter Schafer, who I would like to know, if she's watching, that I am looking respectfully. And also, I think you're pretty cool. Let's be friends. Respectfully. Was that weird? Well, weird or not, Hunter Schafer actually brought a ton of attention to the fight over how identification is used as a weapon against trans people to explicitly make their life more difficult. Following another horrific round of fuckery, one of many and certainly not the last, coming out of the Trump administration, or should I say, the hostile takeover of the global hegemon by unelected ketamine-fueled billionaire boy Elon Musk, with the orange real estate goblin as essentially his sponsor. I would have said human shield, but we all know that's the job of his actual child. As a father to a trans daughter, you would think that Elon would be sympathetic to the plight of trans people. Unless he'd been paying attention to, well, anything for the past few years. Instead, he's making it his business to pay back his child for becoming a happier and more fulfilled person by making life materially worse for anyone even remotely like her. While swinging around chainsaws on the stage of CPAC while off his tits on a horse tranquilizer, and single-handedly destroying American hegemony through federal cuts, thinking he's about to finally destroy the woke elite, not realizing that he's the elite and he's actually pulled the plug on the levers of US dominion. In that way, I suppose he truly is an innovator.
Chainsaw!
Getting back to the matter at hand, Hunter Schafer's latest round in the news follows a blisteringly fucked executive order from the Trump administration, catchily named Defending Women from Gender Ideology Extremism and Restoring Biological Truth to the Federal Government. Nice. In which Donald Trump basically wrote, fuck trans people 500 times in every way it's legally possible, and some ways it's not. And that's even before the new Save Act stuff, where trans people, along with married women who take their husbands' names, will likely be stripped of the right to vote.
According to the directive, which was obtained by The Guardian, visa officers will now enforce a permanent fraud bar under the Immigration and Nationality Act. The provision triggers a near irreversible ban from the country.
Across the country, there's been a wave of government crackdowns on passports that don't match the passport holder's birth certificate, with gender marker changes being put on hold indefinitely. along with a whole host of horrible draconian nonsense, which basically results in every interaction a trans person has with a border officer or any US government official amounting to a humiliation ritual. And that's without even the violence that can come as a result of outing people for no reason, because trans people are much more likely than cis people, especially trans people of colour, of facing violent and violent acts at the hands of even regular people. Never mind people with the power of the state's monopoly on violence backing them up. And that's before we get into the unique ways this interacts with the prison system to make a prison sentence a death sentence. And without mentioning bans on transitioning for children, which, thanks Wes Streeting for making that now the position of all sides of the political spectrum in my country. I hope you're happy you now align with Donald Trump, which, yes, of course you are. Sorry that my country set this precedent.
Look, President Trump, he speaks as he finds. He had a very good meeting with Keir Starmer not too long ago. And of course, he'll be aware of things that we've all said in the past.
The point is, Hunter Schafer, famous actress, model, transgender heartthrob, and Metal Gear creator Hideo Kojima's Ride or Die was forced, after having her passport stolen while at work in Barcelona, to renew her passport. And it came back with one notable difference.
Today, I saw it on my new passport. Male. So, now to specify, my gender markers were first changed in my teens when I first got my driver's license, and then passports following. All have been female since then. Hasn't really been a problem. I've had to do this one time before. No part of the process was different. I filled everything out just like I normally would. I put female, and when it was picked up today and I opened it up, they had changed the marker to male. And I'm not making this post to fearmonger or to create like drama or receive consolation. I don't need it, but I do think it's worth posting to sort of note the reality of the situation and that it is actually happening. And I was shocked. I was shocked because I don't know, I just didn't think it was actually going to happen. And like, I wanna acknowledge my privilege, like not only as a famous or celebrity trans woman who is white and thin and can adhere to like contemporary beauty standards, and I can participate in all of that, and I pass, and it still happened. This has happened to me since I changed my gender marker. We're coming up on a decade now or something. And I do believe it is a direct result of the administration our country is currently operating under. I also want to say, I don't give a that they put an M on my passport. It doesn't change really anything about me or my transness. However, it does make life a little harder. This is getting very long, but I just want to say, trans people are beautiful. We are never going to stop existing. I'm never going to stop being trans. A letter and a passport can't change that, and this administration. And I don't really have an answer on what to do about this, but I feel it was important to share. This is real.
Now, if you're Hunter Schafer, barring running into someone who recognizes you from, say, Euphoria at the airport, you would probably be able to get through most of your interactions in the airport without an issue, with a female gender marker. While she does play down how much this will affect her, given she's rich and white and gorgeous, this change to her passport means that every time she gets her passport out, she is outing herself to the person checking her ID. And at a time where legal and extra-legal attacks on trans people are getting more frequent and more brutal, this is a move that will lead to violence against trans people. And she's right to point out that this might affect her less than some others. Black trans women especially face the majority of transphobic violence, both physically and sexually, and the systemic racism at the heart of American society, not to mention the structural racism in law enforcement bodies like the police or border patrol, means that this move will make that violence, already an epidemic among black trans women, even more common, and potentially even more deadly. Every time you have to show your ID, you are putting a target on your back. And it's the government, the very body that's supposed to exist to protect you and your needs, in theory but very much not in practice, that's branded you with that target. And it is that same government that will provide the weapons that those inclined towards transphobic violence will use to hit that target.
The policy of the government is now that the NHS is broken and we've got to fix it.
There is no escape from being clocked by every single official. And to be clear, this is dangerous in different ways for both passing and non-passing trans people. Non-passing trans people constantly face harassment and abuse for not conforming to people's expectations of how they're supposed to look, and that puts them at risk. But there is risk too for trans women who traditionally pass, who, when people find out they're trans, as the documentation change will enforce, are in danger of being attacked by people angry that they have been tricked. For example, finding someone attractive.
17-year-old Nikki Kuhnhausen was murdered in June of 2019 by a man she had just met hours earlier. Investigators say during a encounter, 25-year-old David Bogdanov discovered Nikki was transgender and struck with a cell phone charging cord.
And that violence is very real, and in the past, people have gotten away with this kind of violence, even when it culminates in it's called the trans panic defense. People have literally gotten away with killing trans people because they insist they didn't know their victim was trans. And when they found out, they turned violent, and that it therefore wasn't their fault that this trans person died. What a cool and normal world we're living in, where the President of the United States is taking measures to make this exponentially more likely.
The stroke of my pen on day one, we're going to stop the transgender lunacy.
And for non-binary people, well, that's a whole other can of worms. If you were living somewhere that you can get an X on your passport instead of the traditional F and M, well, now you can't. And if you're intersex, well, now you're at the mercy of whatever your doctor put down on your birth certificate when you came out too. Roll the dice, that's your gender marker now, no matter what your biology has going on. You better conform to what that letter says on your passport, everyone, or else. Why? What did you think this was? Some sort of land of the free? Someone hasn't read their American history.
What would you do if you were asked to give up your dreams for freedom?
One of the scariest parts about this is just how much shit this executive order tries to do to make trans people's lives immeasurably harder and more cruel. And then there's the fact that this is an executive order with all that entails, namely that it should be able to be challenged. But challenges to it are being met with threats from the president. For example, Maine protested one of Trump's transphobic executive orders and is now being threatened with losing all federal funding.
2 weeks ago, I signed an executive order banning men from playing in women's sports. Many Democrats are fighting me on that. I hope you continue because you'll never win another race. Is Maine here, the governor of Maine? Well, are you not going to comply with it?
I'm complying with state and federal laws.
Well, we are the federal law. Well, you better do it. You better do it because you're not going to get any federal funding at all if you don't. And by the way, your population, even though it's somewhat liberal, although I did very well there, your population doesn't want men playing in women's sports. So you better comply because otherwise you're not getting any federal funding. Every state, good, I'll see you in court. I look forward to that. That should be a real easy one.
To which I would say, Maine, you're pretty far north there, eh? If you got no more financial ties to the US, there's always your friends in Canada. Free healthcare might suit you, eh? How good is your French? Think about it. Anyway, people of Maine. Take it from me as a Brit. Free healthcare is worth seceding for. But while you think it over, Celeste wrote about some of the standout sections of the executive order that brought us to the point where Hunter Schafer is going viral for being rat-fucked by the American president by way of independent journalist Erin Reed, one of the most cited people on this channel, and for a reason. She did a huge rundown of this executive order line by line, which is extensive and fantastic, and which will be in the sources section if you want to go through it and read all the ways in which two of the most cringe and evil men on earth intend to make our lives hell. And I think to myself, what a wonderful world. Trump's executive order, titled Defending Women from Gender Ideology, Extremism and Restoring Biological Truth to the Federal Government, speaks for itself. In Erin Reed's words, It is aimed squarely at dismantling legal and social recognition of transgender people across the United States. As an institutionalized act of hate, it doesn't seek to protect women by any means. Trump loves to proclaim his responsibility for overturning Roe v. Wade, setting reproductive rights in the US back by 50 years, but instead throws the whole weight of the US federal state apparatus onto the lives of trans people. Most notably, Section 2 of the order codifies trans people out of existence by enforcing a binary definition of sex, defined according to the reproductive cells that a person produces at conception, a veiled attempt at fetal personhood. Section 3D of the order demands that US Secretaries of State and Homeland Security, as well as the US Director of the Office of Personnel Management, force passports and other travel documents to reflect an ID document bearer's sex. Will trans people be turned away from the border because they are trans? It's impossible for me to tell yet, though it is a genuine and valid fear. Theoretically, the US has to recognize passports from other countries, but it's hard to tell how they would be able to catch trans passports. Regardless, I expect that trans people with a passport containing an X gender marker can be forced to, when crossing the US border, declare their sex assigned at birth when entering the country, and face additional hiccups crossing the border. Trans people who are non-passing may be forced to do so as well. Trans people may also be known to the CBP under the US government's extensive surveillance apparatus. Under a reasonable interpretation, the CBP might be able to force a trans person to misgender themselves or declare a sex affidavit, similar to Florida, unless they have evidence to their, citing Trump, God-given sex. And yes, this includes body scanners and use in airport security. What's most likely to happen, at least in the short term, is that trans people will face inconsistent treatment at the US's different borders. Some may wave them through and be respectful. This will be in particular true for cis-passing trans travelers, as well as trans travelers who have only ever been known to US authorities under one gender marker. However, given how the same executive order grants license to discriminate and an obligation to discriminate to the entire US government's apparatus, trans people who face disrespectful and discriminatory treatment will have no immediate recourse. Arbitrary detention under suspicion of fraud and other blatant denials of civil liberties may be possible. Broadly speaking, the US government's attack on trans people are nothing short of a genocidal and existential threat towards them, even though not much is known yet, and Trump's executive orders are being introduced on day one for the sake of shock and awe. Volatility is the name of the game. And for that reason, given the highly volatile yet negative situation RE trans rights in the US, I would advise that trans people hold off on any travel plans, including transit, to or through the United States. So, that's fairly worrying. But don't worry, I mean. Secretary of State Marco Rubio is here to support us. A bunch of Democrats approved him for office, so he must be one of the less insane Republicans, right? Over to you, Rubio. I hope NPR is about to tell me that you stopped all of this, despite me having known the kind of person you are for a decade, and my instincts telling me the opposite. People change, right? About a week after Trump signed the order, Secretary of State Marco Rubio suspended passport applications of Americans who chose X as their gender, or who were trying to update their document's gender marker. Now, under new policies, the State Department will only issue passports to say male or female, and that match the applicant's sex at birth. Trump's passport policy already faces at least one federal lawsuit by the American Civil Liberties Union. It argues that the executive order and passport policy are unlawful, unconstitutional, and unmoored from scientific and medical reality. Well, we had a good run. Personally, I think we should aspire to be moored to scientific and medical reality, but maybe that's me being the weird intersection of scientists and socialists that I am. Apparently science sucks now, and medical reality can suck it. Goodbye, healthcare! Hello, fluoride bans and preventable childhood diseases. Goodbye, cancer research! Hello, bird flu! What I'm hearing from this is that the Trump administration is so married to the anti-science necessary to believe that any of their fascist policies make any sense on a planet where people aren't just automatons who want to be slaves in Elon Musk's upcoming Mars colony, that they're one bad harvest away from reinventing Lysenkoism. The theory of evolution is woke. The only ideologically correct biology left standing is the immortal science of Trumpism Elonism. I might have to go and rethink my life after writing that.
This yellow dye, tartrazine, causes tumors, asthma, developmental delays, neurological damage, ADD, ADHD, hormone disruption, gene damage, anxiety, depression, intestinal injuries.
While this state-sanctioned violence on trans people through every method the Trump administration can manage, aside from actually rounding people up or declaring trans people enemies of the state, is ratcheting up pretty fast, and since we're only a month into this nightmare of an episode in the decline and fall of the American empire, we're almost guaranteed to have worse things on the horizon, this isn't a phenomenon unique to America. In fact, across the pond, some of the most extreme measures the administration have taken to make trans people's lives miserable have been enacted by both Conservative and now Labour governments, with more compulsory cruelty along the way. Because we can't have nice things. And even our nominally centre-left party is happily doing absolutely horrific things to trans people. Banning transition for under 18s before the US did, and cozying up to the new fascist regime across the Atlantic. Living in a vassal state to the empire is so much fun. I love having all our parties constantly falling over themselves to fillet the most abhorrent ghouls this side of the gates of hell. The thing is, because the Labour Party is the Labour Party, while they promised to fuck up trans people in a multitude of ways, they also had to make out like they weren't just being pointlessly cruel for the sake of it or just because they hate us. But that they would also make some sensible reforms to make our lives easier in some ways, while making them impossibly harder in way more other ways. Trans people obviously did not believe that they would do the nice things, but a lot of our cis friends and family did. In fact, if I'm remembering my conversations before the election with my friends and family, they insisted to me that they would be fine actually. And wouldn't you know it, I'm starting to feel like Cilla Black. How does that song go again? Labour has quietly shelved plans to make it easier for people to legally change their gender amid concerns about the rising popularity of Nigel Farage's Reform UK. Ministers have mothballed their promised reforms to simplify the process, whereby anyone seeking to change gender in the UK must get approval from a panel of doctors and lawyers. Despite an election campaign which relentlessly promised change, one of Wes Streeting's first acts as Health Secretary was to uphold his predecessor's emergency ban on puberty blockers, implemented without consulting a single LGBT group. Here, Labour has endorsed the suggestion that transition is an undesirable outcome for young people, reinforcing the fiction that there exists a normal, read not trans, gender development during puberty. By doing so, Labour is actively furthering the alienation and stigmatisation of a vulnerable group already facing constant demonisation by the British press and an increasingly well-organised anti-trans movement. Banning gender transition cannot be considered a neutral option. In deploying his power to uphold traditional gender norms, Streeting is telling trans people they will be criminalised if they dare deviate. Labour's ban politically aligns them with 25 US states, all with Republican-controlled legislatures, that have introduced laws barring trans youth from accessing gender-affirming healthcare. Most notably, Labour's manifesto have accepted wholesale the findings of the contested review into NHS gender services for young people, authored by Dr. Hilary Cass. Aside from the significant methodological flaws in her report and emerging evidence she was handpicked for the role because of her sympathy to so-called gender criticals, her argument relies on offensive and conservative notions of trans people. Cass reinforces a medicalised view of being trans, much as homosexuality was once considered a psychiatric abnormality. Her review consistently refers to those wanting to transition as suffering from gender-related distress, and she explicitly rejects the idea that medical care for trans people is a social justice issue, suggesting the effectiveness of treatments for such distress should be measured like those for any other disease. Her medicalisation of trans identity implies that it is trans people themselves who are inherently dysfunctional for their non-conformity, leaving the real dysfunction and source of distress, the enforced gender binary, unimpeached. And the thing is, it's not like things were particularly great for trans people in Britain before the Boris Johnson era onwards brought normalised hatred and institutional trans-bashing back as the uniting principle among all the major parties and every leader. I got through the NHS waiting list back when it was only 6 months long instead of 6 decades, because I am 5 million years old, and I wasn't allowed to be even considered for possibly getting a recommendation for hormone replacement therapy without changing all of my identity documents from male to female and with my new name. This is before I could have any medical intervention. So I ended up with what I have now, a bunch of IDs with my current name and gender marker, which is good, but with the face I had when I was begging to be on HRT, which, as you might imagine, causes a lot of issues with Border Patrol and anyone who wants to check my ID. I certainly wouldn't feel safe stopping at many of the places that people have to change for international flights, where it being obvious I'm trans puts me at risk of jail or worse, and that's without getting into the tug of war I ended up in, where the passport office wouldn't change my name and gender without a doctor's letter, and my doctor wouldn't give me a letter for it without a change in my passport, a situation that took about half a year of begging to finally resolve. I've been assaulted physically and for being trans. I know how dangerous it is for people to clock you. These days I am safer because to most people I pass enough that I get by, but my safety in that respect could be taken away at any moment by a state that I just happened to be born in, that could at any point decide that it's time to punish people like me again and use the fact that they control my documentation to make me a target. For me, like with Hunter, we're going to live. We can probably make this work. But for more vulnerable groups, this is really dangerous, even without any further escalation. And it's not like we even need gender markers on passports to start with. It sounds weird to say that now because we just expect them to be on there, like they've always been there, but they're not. They're a relatively recent invention. Before the late 70s, you didn't have a gender marker on your passport, because we don't need it. We have your name and your face and your country. Is the person on that picture you? Great. Why do we need another letter? Well, because of times like these. Because of a backlash to progressive gains in the way gender was being viewed and expressed in society, and how the right wing decided to push back. 50 years ago. M and F didn't always appear on the federal identity document. In fact, sex was not directly listed on US passports until 1977. According to court documents filed in the ongoing non-binary passport case, the reason gender made its way onto the passport at that time is a fascinating one. The rise of androgyny and unisex fashion in the 1970s is apparently why experts deemed it necessary to include a sex marker. A full-page State Department memo entitled History of the Designation of Sex in US Passports briefly outlines this history. In January 1972, the group agreed to suggest basic standard data elements for passports, including, for the first time, the bearer's sex, the memo notes. This data element was recommended because the experts recognized that, in the light of increasing number of international air travelers, and the rise in the early 1970s of unisex attire and hairstyles, photographs have become a less reliable means for ascertaining a traveler's sex. A 1974 report from the ICAO panel on passport cards corroborates this account. In a section on the recommended information to be included on passports, the report notes that the box concerning the cardholder's sex has been included since first names do not always give a ready indication, and appearances from the photograph may be misleading in this respect. Early US passports use masculine and feminine pronouns in text descriptions, and use the word wife to describe familial relationships. From a historical perspective, it's perhaps only fitting that the very letters used to police the transgender, intersex, and non-binary travelers of today were first introduced to police gender fluidity during another time of cultural upheaval. And this new age of gender markers works fine for most people. We don't notice that there's one more letter in people's documentation. But for trans people, it just makes things that little bit more difficult. And that's with things just as they have been. Even years later, I'm still terrified of the border guards. What if they see my face on the passport and think I'm a thief? What if they realize from that very obvious evidence that I'm trans, and their personal feelings about that, along with the power the state gives them to enact violence on its behalf, means I get taken aside and interrogated? If I were a person of color too, this would be 1,000 times harder. If I were a Muslim, there are many stories of the horrible way border guards treat minorities and women, and especially minority women. And the last thing you want to do is give one of these people, and you don't know which border guards are going to be normal and which might be dodgy, a reason to think that you're suspicious. And then there's the cruelty of changing people's documentation back. In the case of Hunter Schafer and many others in the USA, potentially soon in the UK if West Streeting decides he needs to fillet another Sunday Times columnist, you spent years changing all of your documentation around at the whims of a state that makes these things prohibitively difficult, but something you absolutely have to do or it won't recognize you. At the same time, it's expensive and humiliating. And then it's just taken away, with the stroke of a pen from a man who can barely string a sentence together. Now you are marked. Now you are made a target. You are dehumanized on purpose. Your life now part of a horse and pony show to make the man in the White House feel like a big man. But it's your life that's being fucked with. Now your every interaction with the state is that much more dangerous. Now there are obvious discrepancies in your documents that can and probably will lead to, at minimum, some awkward questions. And then there's the question of whether countries will even let you travel through them with this marker. You would think if the Republicans hated trans people so much, they wouldn't be making it so annoying to get us to leave. And if you do get taken aside, and then you get taken to prison, well then God help you. Even just traveling as a trans person can be dangerous.
My gender markers were first changed in my teens when I first got my driver's license, and then passports following. All have been female since then. Hasn't really been a problem.
Okay, there's the issue. That is a problem. It's a problem when official documents lie.
According to Vice, transgender travelers are particularly vulnerable to invasive searches at airport checkpoints. According to a new ProPublica report, the report, which reviewed complaint data from Transportation Security Administration's website and collected 174 anecdotal accounts, found found that trans and non-binary people can be forced to discuss their genitals with TSA agents in non-private areas, are sometimes subject to invasive pat-downs by officers they don't consent to, forced to reveal their genitals to TSA agents, or otherwise humiliated following full-body scans. According to Pet, age 26, some will say this process is to make sure a woman's cock is not a bomb or explosive of some sort. It's interesting and crazy-making as a trans woman to have a government agency making determinations about whether I pass or not. Next time I go through the airport security, if I'm not singled out to be manhandled by an agent, I will wonder whether they see me as a man. TSA calls this whole process clearing an alarm. It's galling, but not surprising that as a trans woman, my genitals cause alarm. I know this already, but it's nice to have TSA confirm it. And in the case of trans women now being explicitly directed towards men's prisons, that may as well be a death sentence. And that's thanks to something commonly referred to as V-coding, or violence coding, a practice of explicitly marking trans women for violence by inmates and staff. And that's not hyperbole. This is so well recognized, I can go to fucking Wikipedia to give you this information. V-coding is the practice of assigning trans women placed in men's prisons to cells with aggressive cisgender male cellmates, as both a reward and a means of placation for said cellmates, so as to maintain social control, and to, as one inmate described it, keep the violence rate down. Trans women used in this manner are often nearly, and this process has been described as so common that it is effectively a central part of a trans woman's sentence. It is common for correctional officers to publicly strip search trans women inmates before putting their bodies on display for not only the other correctional officers, but for the other prisoners. Trans women in this situation are sometimes made to dance, present, or masturbate at the correctional officer's discretion. Now, you might be asking why I bring up prisons here at all. Well, this executive order is wide-reaching. And of course, one of the big demands of transphobic groups is the removal of trans people from so-called single-sex spaces, usually toilets, changing rooms, women's shelters, and female prisons. The reason given for this is usually some incredibly bioessentialist nonsense about the possession of a penis making you inherently and if you no longer have a penis, then you still have the ideology of because this is actually just about hating trans people and nothing else. Of course, this ignores the fact that trans women are more likely to suffer SA, and black trans women are at the most risk of SA out of any group in society. Trans women are not the perpetrators of these crimes. They are more often than not the victims. That is, if you care about what the data says, which most transphobes and the Trump administration decidedly do not.
I was more of a target because I spoke out about it.
28-year-old Dion Hampton, who goes by Strawberry, plans to keep talking loudly about what she calls the widespread abuse she suffered in Illinois prisons.
Hence the section of the executive order titled Privacy in Intimate Spaces, which, according to Aaron Reed, would have significant impacts on women's detention facilities, prisons, and other similar environments. It mandates that males, defined by the executive order to include transgender women, be barred from women's detention centres. Additionally, it prohibits the use of federal funding for gender-affirming care in those spaces. Policies like these have already been enacted in Florida, where transgender women in custody face severe treatment. They have their heads forcibly shorn, feminine items confiscated, and have been subjected to government-mandated conversion therapy. In one Florida case, a judge went so far as to describe transgender inmates as individuals experiencing short-term delusions. If implemented federally, this executive order could extend those draconian practices to prisons across the United States. And don't get it twisted, this sets the precedent for bathroom bans too, which means trying to come up with a way to enforce bathroom bans. So, showing ID on going to the loo? Having your genitals checked every time you want to pee? Or more likely, any woman who looks sufficiently clocky, and even some that don't, getting harassed by men running into women's bathrooms to protect women's spaces, which will result in mostly cis women being harassed because they're just more cis women, and possibly attacked in the bathroom by people who see trans people everywhere they look, as was the case with an incident recently in the US.
They came in here in the girls' restroom because I'm a girl and they didn't think I was a girl, so they try to come take me away because I'm a girl.
And it's not like transgender bathroom bans are without precedent in the US. We've been in this fight for a while. Almost 10 years ago, North Carolina passed the Public Facilities Privacy and Security Act, commonly known as House Bill 2 or HB 2. This was the first major bathroom ban in the United States, and it was quickly found to be cruel and basically unenforceable. Its mission was to strike fear in the hearts of trans people, to force them out of public spaces, or as the Daily Wire's Michael Knowles would have put it, on the aim of the right on how to deal with the transgender issue,
transgenderism must be eradicated from public life entirely.
Of course, if you don't return to the closet, as ordered by bills such as HB2 or the latest Trump executive order, there's always the other option. You can always challenge the police when they try and drag you back in, and see where you end up. Or you can choose to tell them to piss off. How are they going to know? How are they going to enforce this? The bathroom bill parts of HB2 were repealed in 2017, with the full repeal finally coming in 2020, and anti-discrimination laws protecting queer people from such assaults followed. I imagine we're about to see another swing back towards HB2 and other similar bills. In fact, Hunter Schafer, of all people, was involved in the legal fight against HB2 as part of ACLU and Lambda Legal's challenge to the law, joining the suit against this cruel and discriminatory bill, right before she was even comfortable with public speaking. The trans community and our allies came together to fight this. And this coalition was shown to work. It will be possible again and again. And no matter how many challenges come our way, we can fight them. We have fought them before. We have won before.
The impact of House Bill 2 is personal for one Raleigh teenager. You see, Hunter was born a boy, but now lives as a girl. She's also a part of the first lawsuit to fight the HB2 controversy.
We had to educate ourselves. We had to learn how to be the best parents we can be to a transgender child.
Am I going to break the law and use the bathroom that I'm more comfortable in? Or am I going to follow the rules and risk harassment?
Hunter says she now only feels comfortable using one bathroom throughout her school's campus and often avoids public restrooms. Despite what happens with House Bill 2, the Schafer family wants you to know one thing.
We're your friend, we're your colleague, we're your coworker, we're just a family that's trying to love their kid.
I was not afraid to step forward because there's a voice missing from this. And, where's the medical voice? I kept saying that over those 2 weeks before we joined the lawsuit. Why are they not talking about what the medical association knows about transgender and gender dysphoria and just there's a whole subject that just isn't even being talked about.
But then some battles are harder than others, especially when they intersect with the elements of modern society that are already cruel, already dehumanizing, and designed to crush you under the fist of the capitalist state.
Basically, we have no rights. We're animals, we're creeps, we're we're sissies, and abominations of God.
And this is according to whom?
Administration, directors, wardens, staff.
If you've been watching my channel since the beginning, which there's not a lot of people there because I had like 2 subscribers, you'll remember my video on the transgender prisoner problem, and how trans people are punished twice for breaking the law. First for their crime, and second for the crime of being trans. Which is a quote from a review of the treatment of trans people in UK prisons in 2017, reported to British Parliament back at the least transphobic point in British history, so you can imagine how bad things have gone since.
Being trans is not an illness, and it shouldn't be treated as such.
Times are a-changing. This is J.K. Rowling. She hails Labour's new trans stance. Now, this was based on an interview I did yesterday with Lisa Nandy here on Talk TV. And essentially, J.K. Rowling says she backs Wes Streeting's decision to continue restricting puberty blockers. She waded into the row on this. As we know, there has been huge criticism over this, just to bring you up to speed. So essentially, the last Conservative government said, we are going to ban puberty blockers for young people because we don't know the long-term effects. Many of these kids are confused. And this is based on Hilary Cass and her really iconic report that she wrote. Now, Streeting has faced criticism from within his own party over this move, with members of Labour's LGBT wing writing to him with concerns about an indefinite ban.
As the review pointed out back then, the treatment of trans people in these prisons led to an epidemic of unaliving, with one woman in a male prison saying she felt like an animal in a zoo. 21-year-old Vicky Thompson, a trans woman, died by after being sent to a male prison after repeatedly telling prison and court staff that she would be carried out in a box if she went to a male prison. She died alone in her cell. This was entirely preventable. In the world the new US administration is creating, this will only get worse. A 2021 California study found that 69% of trans women prisoners reported being forced to perform sexual acts against their will. 58.5% reported being violently, and 88% overall reported being made to take part in a marriage-like relationship. Trans women who physically resist the advances of other prisoners are often criminally charged with assault and placed in solitary confinement, the assault charge then being used to extend the woman's prison stay and deny her parole. A 2007 study from the University of California, Irvine found that incarcerated transgender people were 13 times more likely to be than a random sample of incarcerated men. 59% of transgender prisoners reported having been within a California correctional facility, compared to just 4.4% of the incarcerated population as a whole. Having heard all this, knowing all the ways in which the administrative state can and will, at least in the case of the US, attempt to make life difficult for trans people, you might be tempted to feel at least a little bit hopeless. But I implore you not to be. Do not give these people the satisfaction of winning. They want you to feel hopeless. They want you to give up. They want trans people so scared of how they'll be treated that they will stay in the closet forever. They want you to choose between the closet or the casket. Do not let them convince you that these are the only two options. If someone tells you to choose between misery or death, you don't make that choice. You tell them to fuck off. What's more, you work to find ways to remove the very people trying to funnel you into making such a choice. Because anyone who spends their limited time on this earth ensuring life is a crueler place for anyone, never mind people who already have significant hurdles already, is completely unworthy of being in any position of power or influence. It is your duty to live on, to fight this. To stand up and be yourself, and stand up for trans people and other marginalized people, despite these ghouls if nothing else.
Trans people are beautiful. We are never going to stop existing. I'm never going to stop being trans. A letter and a passport can't change that, and this administration.
The working class as a whole, immigrants, black people, indigenous people, queer people, Muslims, disabled people, we're all going to be targeted by this administration and governments around the world falling on their knees to appease the global imperial tyrant. But there are tons of us, and only a few of them. And if we stand together in solidarity, we can beat them. So disrupt and block ICE raids, maintain BDS and March for Palestine, be there and defend trans people, support your community, especially those that are suffering, who are poor, who need your solidarity. Because these wannabe strongmen only win if the people submit. As long as the people they want to roll over stand together, they can resist. Things might get harder in the meantime. In fact, they're almost guaranteed to get harder for a while. But there will be chances to push back, to regain lost ground, to reclaim the world as a place not just for the wealthy few, but for everyone. Even if all you can do is spread word of what is happening to get other people with more time and resources, more time to act, that helps. Do what you can. Everyone can do something, and no one can do everything. So even if it feels like a Sisyphean task, know that thousands of people doing even a tiny bit, with even that, the 99% can move mountains. Hunter Schafer making that TikTok was not a revolutionary act, but it's made millions of people more aware of what's happening. It's made a lot more people panic and get prepared. And not just those it affects, but fence sitters who are previously content to deny what's happening and do nothing, can now see the cruelty on display. You can make your voice heard, and though it may only go as far as your immediate circle, that might be enough. Let others do the rest. Hunter Schafer too has been standing up for other causes too, as we all should be. As is necessary, not just because it's the right thing to do, but because it helps build solidarity. And though not all of us will make headlines like she did for being arrested at a pro-Palestine protest to try and prevent the horrors being perpetrated with US weapons, it doesn't mean that just because we won't make the headlines, that we shouldn't be standing with people of the same temperament, that we shouldn't be taking those same actions. And many, many more besides. We stand together and make each of our struggles a common struggle, like people have in generations before. Just as the LGBT community in the UK stood with the striking miners being crushed by Thatcherism even at the height of the AIDS crisis. Just as the Rainbow Coalition in the United States sought to bring together all people to fight for liberation for all. Just as Cuba aided the cause of ending apartheid in South Africa just as it was being ravaged by the US, and on it goes. That is the future. And if you help build it, it will come. Do not lose hope. Live. If only because it will piss off these arseholes to see you standing after everything they're going to throw at you. In the words of Hunter Schafer, trans people are beautiful. We are never going to stop existing. I'm never going to stop being trans. A letter on a passport can't change that. Fuck this administration. And also, in the words of Hunter Schafer, this is real. Fuck. Thanks for watching. Hey, thank you for watching this video all the way to the end. If you liked it, why not give it a like, leave a comment, subscribe, share it with your friends, tell everyone, and tell the world, and give me money on Coffee or PayPal, links below as always, or Patreon, where if you do that, you'll get early videos, access to members only Discord, my Nintendo Switch friend code, and exclusive content, and your name read out at the end, just like Lee Wilkins, George Geddes, Kira B, No Sparkling Heart, Corey, Matt J, Mighty Than the Sword, Carolyn, Imogen Q, Luciano Frias Andrade, Adam, Harry, End of 191, Cav, Quesadilla de Tortilla Azul, Liron, Adam Lees, Daniel Nevels, no, not that Paul, MB, Madeline Aguirre, Ben Murphy, Lex Phoenix, Enter Kurzitz, Mira D, Jade Senior, Boa Ia, James W, Marvin Orr, Thorngill, Bob the Builder, 5445554, Deborah Laboon, Vegas, Zilla's Athenaeum, Vince Whitaker, Amelia Lisette, Jason Haig, Frank McManus, Susan Foster, Helen Real, Sierra Whiskey, Arestria, Ali Catgill, John N, Lloyd Luciente, Jason Cribbett, Shield Daden, Robin Podolsky, Turtle Choom, Casual Observer, Manta Ray, Courtney Burmack, Sleepy Slug, Philip Witterbrogger, Soma Piglet, Brain Douche, Artie Wolf, Greg Noble, Deanna McMillan, Caroline Regalado, Alexander Lilly, Howard Lott, Neredy Escarjan, and Joey Cobalt. Yep.